Boker Tov, Shavuot Tov, everybody. Welcome to our daily morning class in Chassidut at 9:15 a.m. right here in Yerushalayim. It is always a pleasure to learn together with all of you. Thank you very much to Raya and Mordechai for hosting and broadcasting this year. Now we're starting with Pirkei Avot, Perek Shlishi, the third chapter of the Ethics of Our Fathers, and we're up to Mishnah. None other than Mishnah 5. And in a moment, we're going to see how this Mishnah is very much connected with this week's Parsha. But let's start with the Mishnah, and then we'll go into the deeper interpretation. This is a very fundamental Mishnah, and it's a great way to begin the week. Mishnah 5. Rabbi Nechunya ben Hakana Omer. Rabbi Nechunya, the son of Hakana, says, Kol hamekabel alav ol Torah, whoever accepts upon themselves the yoke of learning Torah, ma'avirin mimenu ol malchut v'ol derech eretz. We take away from that person the yoke of government and the yoke of the way of the land, like doing business. Obviously, when a person does business, especially if you are the employer, then it's a great headache and it's a great yoke upon the person, a responsibility to be able to run the business properly. And every person wants to bring parnasa home. And then the Mishnah says on the other side, V'chol haporek mimenu ol Torah, and whoever throws off from themselves the yoke of Torah, notnin alav ol malchut v'ol derech eretz. We place someone that says, "Oh, the yoke of Torah is too difficult for me. I can't take it." You're trying to throw off the yoke of Torah? So we place upon the person the yoke of malchut, of governorship, and the yoke of the way of the land. So basically, what we're saying over here is as follows. That it's very important to be mikabel alav ol Torah. It's a very important idea. It's very important for someone to accept upon themselves the yoke of Torah, because this is the true yoke. We're going to see in a moment that really a person is here in the world to work hard. The question is, what kind of a labor does a person choose for themselves? Does a person choose for themselves a Torah, a Kedusha labor? Or does a person choose for themselves a worldly labor? For it says in the verse, Adam le'amal yulad, a person is born to work hard. So either way, we have to strive, we have to work hard at what we do. We have a choice. Can we take upon ourselves the regular yoke of the government and the way of the land, of parnasa and bringing alive and livelihood, or the yoke of Torah? If someone chooses for themselves one of the above, then hopefully they're really Hashem is taking away from them the other one. We're talking about if someone takes upon themselves the yoke of Torah. Now, what's the connection between the yoke of Torah and the yoke of derech eretz, the way of the land? The main disturbances from parnasa and the thoughts that really make a person very, very distraught, these thoughts and these disturbances can exchange for the thriving of the Torah. Because also a person who has regular tirdot, regular disturbances, can be very, very, it can take you away from your regular day-to-day matters, which you should be doing calmly, but because you have these disturbances, it takes you away from them. This is why Yaakov Avinu, before he came down to Mitzrayim, he says, "Ve'et Yehuda shalach lefanav Goshna," that he sent Yehuda to Goshen, not Goshen, New York, but Goshen, Egypt, to set up a Beit Talmud, to set up a yeshiva. So by the time Yaakov and his family come to Mitzrayim, there will already be a standing yeshiva and a framework of learning Torah. So the obvious question is, what's the big rush to send Yehuda forward to set up a yeshiva? Wait till you come to Mitzrayim with your whole family. It's not simple to come, to travel. You arrive. It takes you several months or several years to unpack. Some people, it takes them a long time to unpack. And then once everyone is settled, then we could start to think of learning Torah. But Yaakov Avinu teaches us that is not the case. Even before he arrives to Mitzrayim, Yaakov sends Yehuda ahead. Why is it so important to set up a place for a yeshiva for learning Torah? Because learning Torah in a way of shakla v'tarya, of learning and back and forth, and the different reasons to say this way, or the different reasons to say the other way, that is the exchange for the yoke of the way of the land. So Yaakov Avinu knew that the moment that they're going to be totally immersed in learning Torah, then that will save them from the slavery and the headaches from Paro in Mitzrayim. Therefore, as Am Yisrael unfortunately went more and more away from learning Torah, that's when they brought upon themselves much more the yoke of Mitzrayim. Therefore, Shevet Levi, the tribe of Levi, they were exempt from the shibud, from the slavery of Mitzrayim, because the tribe of Levi learned Torah all day and night. They were the ones that kept the Yiddishkeit standing. So in summary of this point, we are here to work. The question is which toil, which effort do we choose for ourselves? Is there anything better than being able to teach Torah, be able to learn Torah, be able to bring Yiddishkeit? Baruch Hashem, we thank Hashem 100 times that this is the great occupation of teaching Torah and being able to bring Yiddishkeit to so many people. Now, do you know that in last week's parsha, Parashat V'Etchanan, we have the first portion of the Shema. Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, and then V'Ahavta until V'Sharecha. In this week's portion, we learn the second portion of Shema, the Hayya Im Shamoah. Very similar, but different. The Gemara, right in the beginning of the Talmud, in Masechet Brachot, tells us that what is the difference between the first portion of the Shema and the second portion of the Shema? The Gemara tells us that in the first portion of the Shema, the main focus is Kabbalat Ol Malchut Shamayim, accepting upon ourselves the yoke of heaven. That's mainly in the first pasuk, Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. But the second portion of the Shema is the main focus is on Kabbalat Ol Mitzvot, accepting upon ourselves the yoke of mitzvot. In other words, also in the first portion of the Shema, we talk about certain mitzvot, learning Torah, tefillin, mezuzot. But in the second portion of the Shema, which we also talk about the mitzvot, that is the main focus. Obviously, when you do Hashem's mitzvot, you are accepting upon yourself His sovereignty. But the main focus is Kabbalat ol mitzvot. Now, if so, it is self-understood that all Torah, all the yoke of learning Torah, is even greater than everything else. As we know that learning Torah is great because it brings to action. And Talmud Torah, learning Torah, is comparison to all other mitzvot. So why does Rabbi Nechunya ben Hakana over here have to tell us about the importance of accepting upon yourself the yoke of Torah? Isn't it obvious? It's one of the most basic things of Yiddishkeit. Shema Yisrael, the yoke of Hashem, all mitzvot, v'hayayim shamoa, accepting upon ourselves the yoke of Torah. So obviously Torah comes even before the mitzvot. So why do we have to have a special instruction? You know what? You really need to accept upon yourself the yoke of Torah. Obvious. Especially that the Pirkei Avot is here not to teach us the basic mitzvot, rather to teach us Lifnim Mishurat Hadin, beyond the letter of the law. The second question is, what is so special about the wonderful reward, quote unquote, the wonderful promise that the Rabbi Nechunya ben Hakana tells us? If you're going to be so special to accept upon yourself the yoke of Torah, then we're going to take away from you the yoke of government and business. You'll be able to you'll have an easy business. You won't have any issues with the government and with business. There are much greater rewards that we can think than just, you won't have the yoke, the headache of government. You know what the Torah writes? If we take upon ourselves the yoke of Torah, in bechukotai telechu, v'natati gishmechem beitam, Hashem will give us rain and reward in this world. So it seems like this promise of Rabbi Nechunya ben Hakana is quite shallow, not necessarily expressing the true great reward that we can have for accepting upon ourselves the yoke of Torah. So the Rebbe explains something beautiful according to Chassidus. You know, in learning Torah, there are two parts. One part is the enjoyable part, and one part is the yoke. The part that, you know, we may not understand the depth of what we're learning, but we learn it because it's important to learn. Whether you want to bring an example from well, there are many examples. Whether you want to say Tehillim, you know, we say Tehillim even though we don't understand always what we're saying, but the words are holy. It could be the words of the Zohar that are holy words, and we learn it because we learn it. Or just in general, let's say you're in yeshiva and they have learning of Gemara, and they have the learning of Mishnah, and they have the learning of Chumash, and they have the learning of Tanya, and so on and so forth. Throughout the day, you have several shiurim, several classes in the yeshiva. So some of them you enjoy more, and some of them you enjoy less. It's okay. We learn the Torah whether we enjoy it or not. So obviously, those points of the Torah which we learn out of enjoyment are much easier to learn. So that's why Rabbi Nechunya ben Hakana, he came to teach us how important it is to learn Torah, even the part of Torah which is not so enjoyable. Especially, who said this? Rabbi Nechunya ben Hakana. Rabbi Nechunya ben Hakana was one of the greatest students of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. And he is the one who wrote the Sefer HaBahir. The Sefer HaBahir, which is one of the earliest Sfarim of Kabbalah, And about Pnimiyut Torah, about the inner part of the Torah. The Torah tells us, that we quote the verse from Shlomo HaMelech, Yeshakeni min neshikot pihu, which means that it's from Shir HaShirim, from the Song of Songs. He will kiss me from the kisses of his mouth, which is an expression which the Talmud also uses. Anytime you understand something, then it's considered like a kiss, like something which is enjoyable, something which is, for example, Paro said about Yosef, Al piv yishak kol davar. Upon his word, every single thing in Egypt should be kissed. In other words, should be followed. In other words, we went a little bit off topic, but the point is that Rabbi Nechunya ben Akana wrote his sefer on Pnimiyut Torah, which is something which is so enjoyable to learn the teachings of Chassidus and Kabbalah. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said about him, Nir'in, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said about Rabbi Nechunya ben Akana, his praises to the other students. Nir'in divrei Rabbi Nechunya ben Akana midvarai umidivreichem. That is exceptional, very unusual, that the words of Rabbi Nechunya ben Akana are understood more than my words and more than your words. Can you imagine? More than his own Rebbe's words? Which means that Rabbi Nechunya ben Akana must have had a very enjoyable Divrei Torah. Therefore, who is the one who teaches us that we need to learn Torah in a way of Kabbalat Ol, of accepting upon ourselves the yoke, even though we may not understand exactly what we're learning? Dafka Rabbi Nechunya ben Akana, Dafka the great tzaddik, who he involved his learning mainly, or also in the teachings of Pnimiyut Torah, the mystical interpretations of the Torah. He is the one who teaches us, you know what? You need to focus also on the old Torah, on the yoke of the Torah, not only on the enjoyable part of the Torah which we have pleasure in, but he needs to strengthen by us that we need to also learn those parts of Torah which may not be 100%, you might not connect to it 100%, but we have to strengthen ourselves in Kabbalat Old Torah. We have to strengthen ourselves in accepting upon ourselves the yoke of Torah. And what is the reward? The reward is Ma'avirin mimenu ol malchut v'ol derech eretz. We take away from that person who learns Torah in a way of Kabbalat Ol, accepting upon ourselves the yoke. We take away from that person the yoke of government and ruling, and the yoke of the way of the land of the Parnasah. We have to understand that these two things are very, very natural. Hashem made in the world that we have the yoke of government. Even in halacha, dina de malchuta dina, we have to follow the way of the land. Also, the way of the land of Parnasah is also part of the nature of the world. The Gemara says you have to go like the minhag of derech eretz, or the minhag of the way of the land. So therefore, if this is a chidush, this is an innovation. If a person accepts upon themselves the yoke of learning Torah, in other words, a person goes beyond their own nature. Remember that word nature. It's very natural to have the yoke of the way of the land and Parnasah. But in this case, a person is going beyond his nature. He's not learning Torah in a way of not only in a way of ta'anug, in a way of pleasure, but he's going beyond his nature and learning Torah in a way of Kabbalat Ol, accepting upon themselves the yoke. Accepting upon themselves the yoke of Torah. So also Hashem will also act with that person in that way. Instead of doing the natural way of a person having upon themselves the yoke of the government and the yoke of parnasa, livelihood, Hashem will make those two natural yokes much easier. Those two natural concepts much easier. It won't be in a way of a pressure, and it won't be in a way of a headache, but it will come much easier because the person did his effort in going beyond his nature and learning Torah in a way of all Torah, the yoke, accepting upon themselves the yoke of Torah. One more point on this Mishnah, beautiful point, is that the Rambam says, what is all Torah? What is the yoke? To read the Torah non-stop, keep on learning, inside, not only by heart to review, but to review, to read non-stop, hatmada, keep on doing it. So according to Chassidus, this is understood. Because it says in the Gemara, based on the verse, the shavtem ureitem, pay attention and look. What is the difference between bein tzaddik la rasha, between a tzaddik and a rasha, bein oved elokim la asher lo avado, between a person who serves Hashem and a person that's considered that he does not serve Hashem? What does the Gemara explain? Well, I'm sorry, that's the Gemara. I apologize. I just quoted, the pasuk is as follows. V'shavtem ureitem bein tzaddik l'rasha, bein oved elokim l'asher lo avado. What does the Gemara explain? She'eino dome shona pirko mea pamim. You cannot compare someone who learns Torah 100 times, reviews his learning 100 times. L'shona pirko mea ve'echad pamim. And between someone who learns 101 times. So the Alter Rebbe explains in the Tanya, in chapter 15, he explains what can be so bad about a person who only reviews his Torah 100 times. The guy who reviews his Torah 101 times, he's called Oved Elokim, a person who serves God, who serves Hashem. And someone who only reviews his learning 100 times, he's considered lo avado. He's not called the person who serves Hashem. What could be the explanation to that? And so the Alter Rebbe explains that we're not saying anything negative about a person who who reviews his learning only 100 times. All we're saying is that we want to see where is the avodah, where is the service, the effort, the dedication. In those days, it was very common that people reviewed their learning 100 times. Because don't forget, it's called Torah Shebal Peh, the Torah which is learned by heart. Really, starting from the Mishnah, and of course the Gemara and the commentaries and everything until today is really all part of Torah Shebal Peh. So we're not allowed to, according to the original instruction, we're not allowed to write down the words of Torah Shebal Peh. So in order for them in those days to remember everything they learned, they had to review it at least 100 times. It was a very common thing. The problem was, 400 or 500 years later, when Rabbeinu HaKadosh, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, saw that we were becoming weaker in our memory, and if we didn't write down the Mishnah, then Am Yisrael would forget it. So all of the rabbis of the generation got together with Rabbi Yehuda Nasi in the lead, and they made a decision based on the pasuk that to save the Torah, they're allowed to write the Torah. But in those days, earlier, just before then, they had to remember the Torah. They had to be total geniuses. They had to remember everything they learned. So someone who learned the Torah only 100 times, reviewed his learning, it was a regular thing. That's what people did. But if you learned one extra time, that changed you from a regular person to a person who does beyond his ability, to a person who changes his nature, someone who works extra hard, someone who tries very hard to make a great effort. And therefore, The Alter Rebbe says that it's like the word oved is like orot avudim, skins which are worked and processed. You have to work very hard in order to prepare a skin of an animal for anything that you need. So you have to work hard. Someone that changes his nature, that's called Oved Elokim. So this is exactly what the Mishnah means. Rabbi Nechoni ben Akana says, Old Torah. Learning Torah alone before you get into the Ol, before you get into the yoke, so to speak. So that's according to the person's teva. That's according to the person's nature. It's nice, it's fine, but you haven't really changed yourself yet. So you're missing a major part in the development of learning Torah. In order to change your nature and your regular dealings in learning Torah, changing your nature, then a person needs to accept upon themselves the yoke of Torah, the old Torah, to be like an eved, like a servant who works hard, and he fulfills the words of the commands of his master, even though they might be against his nature. So we learned today a few perspectives of what it means to accept upon ourselves the yoke of Torah. And I have to say that the yoke of Torah is not only in learning Torah itself, but also in establishing a certain time to learn Torah. Because sometimes we're busy, and it's not always easy to dedicate a person's time for the learning of Torah. And when you put your personal needs aside, and you dedicate a certain amount of time, whether it's an hour or 2 hours or 5 minutes or a half hour, you are changing your nature. You are going beyond the nature. That's why mincha is considered the greatest tefillah, because it's smack in the middle of the day. A person's working, he's running, going, shopping, and he stops in the middle of the day and he dedicates a few minutes or a half hour for davening mincha. That is extra special. And therefore, it's extremely important to keep this in mind about the yoke of Torah and the yoke of mitzvot and the Ol Malchut Shamayim, the yoke of the kingdom of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Thank you very much for joining us. I want to remind you that tomorrow evening we're going to have a special shir in the letters of the Alter Rebbe in person. So please try your best to come here and to strengthen the shir. And also, Thursday evening, there's going to be a very special event. The Rebbe instituted that every child should have a letter in the Torah. So since 1981, there have been 6 Torahs that have been finished. And this Thursday, on the Rebbe's father's yard site, there's going to be a huge Hachnasat Sefer Torah, finishing, concluding the 7th Torah. Can you imagine a few million children over the past 40 years, exactly 40 years, have had letters letter in the Torah which has been written in their honor. And so I think it's starting at about 5 or 5:30. I highly recommend for you to come and participate, even if it's for an hour or so. It's a great zechut and a great mitzvah. All the best. Have a wonderful day, and Bezrat Hashem tomorrow morning, 9:15, right here. All the best.